Okay, so this has been I'm in California. It's been a pretty interesting year around fires. I know we've had a lot of different issues, and I guess the question that's kind of facing me is not to start something with a little bit pessimistic, but um, is it, do we have all the information we need and we're just not being able to implement it? Or are we still struggling with some of those major science questions, especially facing all of these changes coming at us? Um, so is this like, is it more of a science issue question, or is it more of a management? We just don't have the capacity to do some of the mitigation things or to restore ecosystems in the way that we need. And we have people from the south and from all over the country, right? And it's um, I know those of us in the west sometimes look to you guys in the south and are a little bit jealous of how much burning you get to do, um, and just kind of dealing with how do we get there. So
Oh, well, in Tennessee, speaking from Tennessee viewpoint, I know that we don't have the as much emotional connection to fire as you probably do out west. I don't mean to presume things, but um, uh, I see the news, so there's less of a connection in the South to wildfire damage. Although we saw a taste of it in 2016, Gatlinburg. Um, we don't see it recur annually. So it makes a difference. So I think we're much more management focused out here. And I would say it's not a free and open burn whatever you like, whenever you like type of situation. We deal with municipalities and fire departments that want to volley kind of back and forth about who's in charge and whether it's a good idea. So it's not. I guess it's not just whenever we want. Also, we're vastly limited in our window to burn as far as good conditions go, versus. I know you have much more fire danger days out west, but and those are much fewer here. But still, we don't have good days a lot to burn as much as we need to. We've got a list far longer of places we'd like to burn uh, versus opportunities to do that. And as well as resources. So we have our staff is all red carded, but um, coming into a larger burn, we have to ask for help, and sometimes that help is hard to locate because sometimes they're out west helping. But so there's just different resource challenges is all, I think.
I know Tennessee and Florida are very separate states, but coming from someone who's also a little bit more in that, I would say, more active prescribed fire culture, Sasha, do you have anything to add for that?
So I would also, you know, echo most of what Murray said there. We still have a lot of complications in Florida. You know, we have such a tourist-based economy, and with that, we have lots of visitors. And so, you know, we have several major interstates that are, it's getting harder and harder to burn on. You don't have like times a year where there's not large amounts of traffic and stuff. And so I would say that, you know, a lot of the corridors through California, even though there's a lot of wild space, there's a lot of big corridors and there's a lot of people there still. And, you know, that can be daunting trying to change a culture where you have people kind of like Florida that are moving there constantly. And Tennessee is getting that way too, you know. But, and so trying to keep that culture engaged in that fire is a useful tool rather than just something to be afraid of, when what you see on the media most of the time is, you know, the shock value and the horrific loss. And so I would say that there's actually been a lot of work on the West Coast, and like, you know, it's moving that direction, but there's just such a backlog that in the Southeast there was more private landowners that were still doing it the old way, that were, you know, personal for agricultural purposes or for kind of hunting and gathering in a modern form of it, you know, mountain people or even berry pickers in Florida. Some of those practices were sustained, and they weren't able to overcome some of those cultural burning practices that were kind of run out a lot harder of other areas. And so we have a head start there in that, you know, we don't have as big of a backlog to go into, in that some of our, you know, natural areas were still maintained by fire because we have regular lightning fires, you know. A lot of the stuff in California right now, we're dealing with things like power line issues and things that are creating issues that we weren't even foreseeing being, I mean, people have been talking about it, but the magnitude of it and the infrastructure of people and trying to move those people out of areas and plan for things like that is just, it's a lot different. And I think there's a lot of people who are heavily engaged, and there have been people talking about it for decades. You know, some of the first prescribed natural fires were actually in the Yosemite Valley and stuff like that. So people have been using fire as a tool there from a governmental standpoint, but also from a cultural standpoint for, you know, centuries. So it is there. It's hard to overcome the issues you have with a population that's not familiar with it and it not engaging it. But every time we get on the news now and have those conversations about proper management involves mitigation, and some of the best mitigation we can do is putting fire back into these fire suppressed landscapes. So I would say that that's the good news of the catastrophic side, is it allows those conversations to occur and gives us a platform to kind of push for why fire is so important on these landscapes.
I think the backlog issue is, I guess it's interesting to hear that it's like in my head, I think of the South as being pretty on top of it in a lot of places. And it's, you know, you still have, both of you were mentioning that there's still a lot of work to do, a lot of areas to burn. So I definitely feel like that is an issue here, just the scale of what needs to happen in the short potential period of time that we have. Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was kind of curious. I mean, Illinois, we modeled our right to burn law and our other laws pretty much after Florida's. One of the things, though, that really, as we were implementing, we spent a lot of time building relationships with the fire suppression community, and along with the agricultural community. And in fact, we don't require in Illinois a farmer to have a prescribed burn. They have the right to burn on their property without going and becoming a burn manager. We don't recommend it, but they can. And just that kind of building the community seems to have really helped us get wider acceptance. Now we have some of the issues. I mean, right now we're under red flag warning, or yesterday we were under red flag warning, and I heard about a combine got burned up, which is our typical big fires that we have is in the cornfields during the dry season when they're when they're doing it, and that makes all the news. But right now, prescribed fire doesn't hardly have anybody show up anymore in terms of the news media. So it's become so commonplace here at that point. What kind of relationship occurs, particularly in the West, between the fire suppression communities and the people who are advocates or are looking at prescribed fire, using fire for mitigation and those kinds of things? Has those discussions taken place, or is it still somewhat a rough relationship?
Jessica, are you just starting? Okay.
No, I was just going to say from a Utah perspective, so we're Summit County of Utah, which is very close to Salt Lake County. We're the Wasatch back of the Wasatch Front, right? So we're close to the major population of Utah. The conversations have been happening a lot, but when you start to get close to implementation, there's so much fear of fire and so much fear, because everything that we're managing and all the conversations we're having right now are in those WUI areas. They're really close to populations, and so people are so fearful of fire that it's almost it just stops the conversation about that being part of the mitigation practice. You know, we burn piles, but to actually think about doing an actual prescribed burn on a property it's just like you just don't go there. And we all, as you know, professionals know that that's, you know, a tool in our toolbox we need to be using. You know, you can't take fire completely out of the system, and that one of the best things we can do is to put that back onto the ground. But it's just such a cultural hurdle for us. And, you know, even from the governor's standpoint, there's support, but then you start getting close to implementation and it just gets shut down.
And of course, I'm sure we've all seen piles that didn't ever get burned, and that's a whole nother sided issue. And I'm based in California, and I would say that it's definitely getting better. There's been a lot of work between, especially our state suppression agency, CAL FIRE. They actually now have just started having these prescribed burn crews with the idea that they're doing predominantly prescribed fire and can only respond to suppression if it's like if it's an emergency, basically. Because a lot of us, you know, it's a really long state, and so there might be areas where it's the best time to do prescribed burning, but there's still an active fire in another part of the state, and that's kind of, I think, created a lot of tension. And so we're trying to deal with that, and I think there's some good relationships emerging. There's definitely some support from the state side of things. And then as far as the Forest Service, I think that most people, even in the suppression side, understand the need for fire. It's just that the worlds don't always work well together, and so I think it's getting better on that front too. But it's almost like, you know, just the seasonality of things is really, I think, a biggest barrier for us here. I think, I think I was going to change it. I'm curious. I know we had a lot of people who are more on the research side of things, and one question I always like to ask for that is, if you had unlimited funding and resources, what would be the thing that you would study around fire? Like, what's a really big gap or research need, or something that you feel like we just don't have enough information on?
I can give my answer for that one. I think something I've been really interested in lately is the interaction between snow and fire. Because in some places, if you have fires, then because of a combination of more sun reaching the snowpack and also having ash on the snow for at least the first few years after fire, then you can melt the snow earlier, which is bad for downstream water resources. But in other areas, it seems that thinning the forest actually allows the snow to accumulate more, and you have more snowpack saved. And that's just so important the snow is just so important to Western water resources. And it's such a complicated relationship between snow and fire. And there's feedbacks too, because if you have places with more snow, it keeps it wetter and makes it so that the snow might not burn, or the fire might not burn as severely the next time around. So I would instrument snow sensors all over the mountains if I had unlimited funds, and pay a lot of people to analyze all that data coming in. Because that ends up being a lot of the problem too with research, is we get a lot of really good data, but then there's not the time to really sit and analyze it and use it in detail. So a lot of the research funding you get is to go out and get new data, and you know, they want something good to come out of it, but then kind of often you get new data and then you get one paper out of it, which is great, but like I'm sitting on some data sets right now, there's probably 3 more papers worth of work in there. But no one wants to give funding just to write more papers with the data that you already have. They want to move on to the next thing.
It's also hard to find somebody who's willing to just make that their project, to sit and
Yes,
just
that's
write
it.
papers on the data. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you are doing a little bit of that, right? Like, you are already kind of working on that snow fire connection.
Yeah, yeah, and I am expanding it somewhat in Yosemite, or that's the plan, working on research permits now. But I have gotten some more funding to look at that. And there's some other data sets that exist throughout Yosemite on snowpack. So yeah, I'm trying to do more of that. But it's really hard because it's so spatially variable in the Sierras in terms of the amount of precipitation that falls in the first place, and then what the snow does. Yeah, so I am doing some of that already, but if I had unlimited money, I would do it more and bigger.
Great. Anyone else on the research side? And also, I mean, I guess I said the research side, but I know a big part of my job is often, you know, I'm talking with people who are doing things on the ground and they need really specific information. It's not these broad science questions they need. It's more like, how do these three species interact with fire at this certain season or time? And that's, I think, another big side of it is just taking and translating, which like that's a big part of my job, but it's also a difficult part because getting really specific can be hard. But anything from like, even if you're working on the landscape, maybe a species or an interaction that you're feeling like we just don't have the answers for yet. Go ahead, Ale.
Prior to moving to California, I was working with Mississippi State University, and part of my work there was studying the upland oak forests in Mississippi and eastern oak forests in general. And a lot of the forests out there, as many of you who work out there know, are seeing a lot of generalist and more mesic species like red maple, and in Mississippi we had a lot of hickories coming in. And once those species get established, it's really hard to return fire to the landscape. The whole time that I was in Mississippi, we were trying to implement a summer burn, and the forests were just too cool and humid to even get a fire started. But we think that a lot of fires, or many of the fires may have occurred during that summer season in the long history of the region. And so we were trying to re-implement those summer burns and we just couldn't. And so I think a really interesting research area that my old lab and many other people out there are trying to understand is how do we get fire back on the ground when we have these kind of recalcitrant communities of red maple and hickories and other species that make it really hard to put fire back. So that was a really interesting area of research, I think.
I will say there have been moments where we've tried to do broadcast prescribed burns here, and it has also been too cool or too wet, which, a whole nother side of implementation that can be difficult. So
to go back to your thing about the science aspect, the one thing I would say that has been something I've really been trying to work on personally, but also encourage other burners to do is work with like the joint fire science program and really trying to get the practitioners to interact with the scientists and researchers and trying to figure out like how we can get that exchange better, because we have people that are researching a lot of stuff, but if that doesn't get down and get to the people on the ground in a way that they can utilize it to make better fire decisions, it doesn't really have the value. And in the same way, if we aren't communicating as a practitioner group to the researchers about what we're trying to figure out, we're missing a big opportunity there. And I know there's some stuff from a management side, but there's a lot of science that can be done that's very directly impactful that, we can make changes in how we burn by knowing small differences. One of the big ones that comes to mind is the soil moisture for pine duff. And they went ahead and figured it out, and it's 86%. So if you burn at above 86% soil moisture, you don't get the residual fires and the bowls around the big pine trees. And it's like, for us in the Southeast, knowing that kind of stuff, that's saving, acres and acres of old stands that, just that small difference, not everybody's going to go out there and measure it with an instrument, but still knowing like, hey, how deep is that soil actually moist? That's what's going to kill these trees, not, the scorch there's always multiple factors, but working with the researchers and trying to bridge those two communities. And so I'd really like to put in a plug for like the joint fire science programs and the fire exchanges, because I think that that's a huge opportunity and, somewhere we need to work together better to answer questions that make a big difference. So.
And this is a personal question of, so I guess as a practitioner, you've had success with that, and it's like you've been able to give input and then get something out of it. Is there like a barrier at all for you or for other people you're seeing that like don't want to interact with researchers for a reason? Like, is it a capacity issue, or is it like what barriers have you seen, I guess?
I think there are some barriers that we assume exist that don't necessarily. And some of that is just, our factors. What it comes down for me is like, how good are you at statistics? Because when you're reading a poster or an article and like you go into that stuff, it can lose some folks, and so how do you translate science to people, and that's a key factor there. That's probably one of the biggest factors, but also just What do people need to know? What questions is it that on the ground people are asking? Like, is it, you know, stand density? At what point does the fire go from a ground fire to a crown fire with a certain stand density? You know, like, is that what we need to know for a management side? But if we're not talking to the people, you know, the division soups or whoever's dealing with that, or, you know, from a prescribed fire standpoint, the practitioners, like, how do we establish good management practices if we don't know what the biggest concerns are? And so making sure that practitioners have an avenue to ask questions is a key component there. And so that, again, that's where those, you know, consortiums or prescribed fire councils and things like that really can connect people. And, you know, I see that as a huge component of us moving forward nationally and internationally for fire science, you know?
Thanks for the plug. Yeah, it's not always easy, but when it works so well, like on every page. So we're definitely trying to do more of that. I did see that Dale, you joined us. No pressure, but if you have access to a microphone or a camera and want to just briefly let us know who you are and where you're coming from, and if you want a childhood fire story. And you can also type in the chat if you're interested. Oh, we had one more person join us too. They're connecting to audio.
Hey there, this is Dale. It took me a minute to find the unmute button for some reason. I should have this figured out by now, right? As long as we've been doing Zoom, but anyway. I'm a biologist in the with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Raleigh office, and I don't really do a lot with fire directly, but a lot of my species that I work with are fire dependent, so I thought I would just kind of drop in here and just try to eavesdrop a little bit and listen and learn. So that's all.
Great, thanks, Dale. And we also had Lori Blackmore, if you wanted to just let us know who you are and where you're coming from.
Hi, sorry. Lori Blackmore. I'm with the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and kind of like Dale just said, I'm just dropping in to hear what you guys have to say. I'm sorry I'm late. I was dropping out of another meeting. So hi, everybody. Oh, look, you can see my eyebrow. There you go. It's me.
Hello. And if you want to, we also started with any story from your childhood that you remember about fire. So we had a lot of campfires and that sort of thing.
Blimey. Yeah, that would be it. Sorry, that's kind of not original. Also not thinking of that.
No worries.
Fire is amazing. Fire is cool. Fire is a hugely underutilized tool in management. I'm in the Southeast, but I'm from the Northwest, and I just think it's astonishing that people are talking about prescribed fire as though that were something novel. But that, yeah, anyway. So
we forgot here for a little bit. There's a lot of people in the West forgot about prescribed fire for a little bit there.
But that's what my background is. I don't understand. By training, I'm a forester, and prescribed fire is something there. And anybody who learns about anything east of the Cascades, you know, what those systems are set up to do. Not so much with the, you know, in the Pacific Puget Sound Basin and stuff, but even there they had spot fires and stuff. It's not as much of a management tool there. But anyway, I have lots of opinions. I'll go ahead and mute myself.
Feel free to unmute later. So we were talking about a couple of things. Has anybody had a burning question that they want to talk about? I've got a whole stack of them. Yeah, go ahead, Jess.
No, I just wanted to kind of keep going with the research side, like as a land manager and some supporting research that I could really use to help sell the story of why fire management or why mitigation and why prescribed fire is so important for the landscape. One of the things, so our community is really focusing right now on carbon sequestration, and when we just recently did this mitigation site, we got a lot of pushback from the public questioning how cutting live trees and doing mitigation is actually benefiting the carbon footprint, how we're, you know, doing good rather than harm to our areas. And you know, you can pull 10 articles on both sides, but it would be nice if there was a more predominant I mean, I don't know, maybe we just need more research on the fact that taking out the unhealthy, small, tiny little trees that are struggling in our system actually benefits the larger tree and, creates a situation that we want to get to without actually negatively impacting our soil and our ability to store carbon. I don't know if anybody can speak on that, but if there's any research out there that anyone knows about, I'd love to know what you have.
And where in Utah are you? Which ecosystem are you
So
from?
we're in Park City, Utah. So it's predominant mixed montane forests, Douglas fir, white fir, oak, maple kind of situation.
And I know when you were talking earlier, you mentioned that like for prescribed fire, you had a lot of people who were hesitant. Is it like the general public, or is it your suppression people you're working with, or?
No, generally the fire districts and the Forestry Fire State Lands Division that I work with are very supportive of it, and they do implement those on parcels that are further away from communities. But it's when you get into that urban interface, it's just too scary of a topic, and no one wants to go there. The liability is too high. The pushback from the community is too high. We have too many elected officials who don't want to put their necks out, and it's just not an accepted practice in our WUI area, which is probably the place we need to do it most. So, the cultural side of this is I think our biggest barrier. I mean, the science is there. It's just convincing the community and the populations around that, that not doing something is not an option. Half the folks that live in this one area that's next to one of my open space say, well, the fire is going to come anyway, so why do we do anything? And that's really even at the same time when there's 1 million acres burning in California, this conversation is happening in Utah. It's just astounding to me that we haven't broken that conversation yet. And I know it's just different everywhere, but we struggle. I feel like Utah is sometimes 10 years behind everybody. So,
I mean, I think I will say that I'll make a plug of, we always measure things in acres burned, and that's it's far too basic of a measurement, right? Like how a fire burns is oftentimes so much more important than just the number of acres. And even California, like some of the situations, even in some of the bigger fires and some of the smaller fires too, but it's burning through in a potentially good way, like it's good fire, even though it was started as a wildfire and was being actively suppressed. But it's still going to go into that tally of, millions of acres burned, but it was maybe ecologically beneficial. So I don't know how to deal with that one, but it's definitely an issue I've seen. Oh, Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering if one of the issues, and this has always seemed to be the crux so often, has been, it's really almost a legal issue, a liability. I've heard the word used numerous times in this discussion. I'm wondering if the approach we need to take, and again, the fire consortiums and the research, we need to start looking at this as in a new legal framework, providing some level of liability protection associated with prescribed fire or properly done fire, and providing some relief. And I hate to say it, but it all often comes down to working with legislators and those kind of folks who realize that that a lawsuit here and a lawsuit there adds up to major wildfires because we can't implement what we need on the landscape. So addressing liability issues seems to be the key thing that maybe fire councils and some of the other organizations really need to try to focus in on. I don't know. It just seems to me that that's always what's been the problem from day one with prescribed fire, has been the liability issue. Is there any movement in the fire councils out west to try to address that? I know there's been huge stuff relative to power generation and some of the problems associated with that and starting fires. Has there been any similar movement on other use of fire, protect liability.
There is some movement. Sorry, I have a fly. I'm looking for this article I was reading not too long ago, and there's a bipartisan effort in California by two legislators who are trying to do exactly what you said, which is almost, and it's kind of, we're almost circling back to where we started, and it's where they're going to start protecting agencies from frivolous lawsuits that stop science-based management on public lands. And you know, I think that protection came in at a good point in our time, like back in the 70s, where we did need those lawsuits to slow down things that weren't good. But I think we've almost come a full circle back in the fact that now we need to stop some of these from slowing down management and almost make the people who are stopping the projects liable for the damage if something were to occur. So, and it was an article that was in, I believe, the New York Times. If I find it, I'll throw it in the chat. It was a good read.
Yeah, there's the one out of the Northwest that's about prescribed fire, trying to have like a national prescribed fire program, basically. And then there's also the Feinstein, I think someone from Montana is the co-sponsor, the Republican from Montana. And I mean, I will say this is not the first time that I've seen some pretty promising legislation go up, but it's still sitting at like the Senate level, and so that have to go through the whole process. But this isn't the first time, and so maybe one of these will go through. But there's, you know, I think there are legislators who are aware of this trade-off that we're going to have fire. Do we want it this way or this way? And they're trying to push for that. Go ahead, Lori.
Sorry, unmuting. I'm sorry, I'm coming in late. Have you guys talked about, and I'm curious, Randy, what you brought up there. When I lived in Idaho for a number of years, the people were growing grass, farmers were farming grass and grass seed. And every fall, they'd all be burning off their fields because that's what they need to do. There's heavy pall of smoke everywhere. It wasn't forest fires, it was the grass fires, and they were managed. And I'm just curious what those landowners and what that group of people who burn the fields after they've done their fields, how they address the issue of litigation and protecting themselves against what if it gets away or something. So I think a huge part of this is what everybody's around is people are afraid of fire, whether it's they don't want their house to burn down or they don't want the fire to get away and then get litigated against. And so I wonder if other groups, or if you guys are familiar with other groups that have insurance or ways of writing policies and stuff that protect themselves.
Well, the one thing that we did in Illinois, and it's based on what Florida did, was we addressed the kind of the level of liability associated with fire. Most places, fire is strict liability. If you caused it, you're responsible for whatever happens. In Illinois, we were able to move that to the point of negligence. So if you were a prescribed burn manager and gotten your certification, you would and followed the regulations in terms of your plans and so forth. Your level of liability was set at negligence. And then ultimately, I think Florida actually has a gross negligence, right? You guys have been able to pull that off. We haven't gotten there yet in Illinois.
It still says gross negligence, yeah.
And so that was one thing that really helped quite a bit. We've also had some discussions on and off with insurance companies. And it's kind of interesting because insurance companies and lawyers have slightly different motivations for liability issues. And in fact, when our biggest folks opposing our fire bill originally was the local, the Illinois Bar Association. They opposed it when it went through. And the only reason it got changed is the attorney who was the president of the Bar Association happened to be doing prescribed fires on one of his properties, and one of his contractors contacted him and kind of moved him off center so that they kind of backed off, and some compromises were developed as a result of that. But so those are the couple of things, but still, I mean, liability, even though those are in place, liability still is a fairly major concern. And again, a lot of it's because we hear what's going on in California, and every time you turn around, you hear the fire issues. My son lives in LA, in the Valley, and of course he's been surrounded by fires several times in the last 5 years, and so people come to me on a regular basis and say, "Oh, is your son safe?" And questions like that. There's such a fear factor associated with fire in the West right now that. But like I said, if we could address liability, at least we can address that's something we could do. The fear factor, I'm still haven't figured out how to do that other than just slow, continuous education.
And I think we only hear about the prescribed fires that escape. So we're trying to both talk about the good prescribed fires that happen that you never hear about otherwise. There's some movement to try and get like we have a state-funded earthquake insurance fund, and we're trying to get that for prescribed fire, basically, so that there'd be like a pool you can buy into to do prescribed fire, even as like a private burn boss. And then there's like a burn boss certification program to hopefully try and give some credentials so that it makes it a little bit easier. These are all in the works. Haven't seen it working out yet, but it's things we're definitely talking about, because that is always one of the biggest issues. Is that fear. Even as the person who's lighting the fire, even though you're doing everything right, in some states you could still be held liable. I posted a quick link that just briefly goes over the different kinds of liability laws, and then it goes on to say what's in California. But it does make a big difference on ability to burn. I do see we have 8 minutes left. I think this conversation, we can keep going. I did want to put a shout out that if you haven't spoken up yet and wanted to, we're going to give you a hot second to say if you wanted to jump in. Then we can go back to anything we've talked about, but I also wanted to touch on the post-fire issues. So restoration after post-fire. I know that's a big thing we're facing here. I guess just any thoughts or questions around post-fire issues.
I'll jump in here. This is Mark. Here, let's start my video. This is a topic I've been very interested in, and kind of going back to your question earlier, Stacy, about science unknowns and what we know. I'd say there's a lot that we know in terms of fire. It's how it's an important ecological process, and where there's a lot, looking in states like California, there's a huge backlog of fire in places like the Sierra Nevada and elsewhere. But post-fire restoration, I think, is an area where we have a lot of room to develop a better understanding of what's going on and how to manage landscapes, because a lot of the approaches for post-fire restoration were developed decades ago, say reforestation techniques. And many of these are pretty outdated when we think about the scale and the scope of the fire impacts we're seeing on our landscapes today. I mean, I'm just sitting on the other side of the creek fire right now. It's a 300,000 acre plus fire that's undoubtedly going to produce some fairly large high severity patches where we're going to see pretty major ecosystem impacts. And the question, there are many, is how do we deal with landscapes this huge with a fire, whether on public lands or private lands or both, which in this case they are. It's kind of a mix, mostly on the Sierra National Forest elsewhere. And I could go on, in terms of listing a number of those questions. But the bottom line is, how do management agencies and their partners deal with landscapes like this? I'm really curious to hear what other people have to think. I'm touching on this topic with a presentation in early November, but I'd be curious to hear whatever others think about this.
I don't have anything too helpful about dealing with huge landscapes, but a topic that I've been hearing about that I think is really interesting is thinking about if you're trying to revegetate a large high severity area, should you try and revegetate it with exactly what was there before? Or is it better to maybe bring in some seed stock or seedlings from something lower down that maybe is able to handle warmer, drier temperatures to sort of help evolution and migration along in a direction that it'll be more drought tolerant and maybe fire tolerant in the future? I don't have too much more to say about that. Just something I thought was interesting.
Yeah, it's actually interesting you brought that up. So that is something we're implementing in one of our treatment areas, is to actually reseed a different successional tree that could possibly be the next species in our area. And we don't have a lot of research behind it, but we're going to I have an experimental forest that we manage with the State Forestry Office. And so they really want to start bringing in, species that they wouldn't necessarily see in that area and see how it works. So it is something we're going to try, but it's not a post-fire, it's more of a mitigation strategy.
No, that's great. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the participation and getting to know you all.